The shocking truth behind the Nephilim giants and the Deluge mystery, the words alone make the imagination tilt toward shadowy ruins and buried bones. But the real shock is quieter, more carable, and far more intimate than mere size or spectacle. Before the flood, when the earth still held memories of Eden and a human voice could name things with a child's authority, something crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed. It was not only a matter of bodies growing large, it was a betrayal of boundaries, heavenly and earthly, creator and creature, gift and idol. That crossing changed a world. Imagine the early generations, fresh from the garden's fading light. They remembered the rivers and the ordered work of stewardship. Yet humanity's story did not remain one of simple dependence. It quickly grew complex. Cain, who once walked under a different sky, left the presence of his family and built a city named for his son, Enoch, Genesis 4. Out of that city life arose craftsmen and bards, tent dwellers and metal workers, Jabal, who gave shape to pastoral life, Jubal, who gave voice to music, Tubal-Cain, who learned to forge instruments of bronze and iron, and Nama, a name quietly preserved among them, Genesis 4. These were not mere footnotes. They were the seedbed of civilization, tools, songs, homes, and livelihoods. Yet gifts that should have led back to worship were turned inward and upward toward the self. Talent became trophy, invention became pride. The world that once tended the garden began to tend itself. This cultural flowering created a stage on which something else arrived. Genesis records a brief, stark paragraph that has troubled and fascinated interpreters for centuries. When the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were fair, they took wives for themselves. Genesis 6, 1-4. It is here the narrative grows dark and compressed. The terse words suggest a rupture at the interface of the heavenly and the earthly. Who are these sons of God? What does it mean that they took wives? What are the consequences of such unions? To answer those questions is to touch the heart of the shock the title promises. There are several ways to read the phrase sons of God. Some propose it points to godly descendants of Seth. Others read it as royal or aristocratic human claimants to divine status. The traditional reading followed here and affirmed by ancient Jewish and Christian interpreters understands the sons of God as angelic beings, heavenly creatures who abandoned their appointed order and crossed the boundary between the immortal and the mortal. This is not an assertion presented as an unquestionable historical fact, for scholars debate it, but it is the interpretive line that aligns the sparse Genesis narrative with the later New Testament references that allude to angels who did not keep their proper domain. Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4. Those passages speak of angels who sinned and were cast into chains. They are a theological lens, suggesting something more than mere human miscegenation. The view followed here treats Genesis 6 as a story of transgression, heavenly beings who left their place, mingled with humanity, and produced an offspring called the Nephilim. The name matters. Nephilim, from a Hebrew root often rendered fallen ones or giants, are described in the same compressed paragraph of Genesis as men of renown. That phrase weds physical stature to cultural influence. They were not simply large men, they were archetypes of power. Picture them at the edges of nascent cities, taller than the surrounding roofs, their shadows swallowing huts and altars. They were famed for hunting, for feats of warfare, for throwing their weight behind kings and idols. Some accounts within the biblical imagination suggest that their fame made them objects of reverence. Where there is size and force, human hearts can quickly confuse strength for divinity. The Nephilim's existence thus symbolizes the dangerous inversion of creaturely gifts. Strength becomes dominion without covenant. Talent becomes tyranny without gratitude. This was not merely an aesthetic or social problem. The narrative quickly ties these manifestations to moral collapse. Genesis 6 continues, "The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5-7. The presence of the Nephilim coincides with a culture in which violence multiplies, altars are redirected, and the innocent are crushed beneath the wheels of power. The proud arts of Cain's descendants, metalwork turned into weapons, music that celebrates conquest rather than praise, cities that become monuments to human hubris, become instruments in a larger moral decline. Where once craft pointed toward care for creation, it now fuels oppression and cultivates a religion of strength. It is here that the shock deepens. The Nephilim, whether understood as hybrid beings or emblematic rulers who inspired deification, brought with them not only size, but an ethos, the normalization of coercion and a reorientation of worship. Buildings rose to honor themselves. Altars were laid not to the creator, but to the self-made lords. Tribute and slavery spread like rot under that light. Those who once would have bowed in awe to the creator bowed instead before granite collars of power, men who demanded cultic devotion. The moral compass of humankind slid. Technology and talent were corrupted because their origin, the heart, was severed from gratitude. And yet within this wide-scale corruption, the biblical narrative gives us a different kind of figure for contrast. While giants throw their shadows over cities, one man stands in quiet fidelity. Genesis calls him a righteous man, blameless in his generation, who walked with God. The phrasing is simple, but its force is profound. Where the culture loudens into spectacle, Noah's integrity is steady and unadorned. He does not build monuments, he listens, he obeys. God's instructions to Noah are not poetic, they are measured and practical, almost shockingly so. The ark's dimensions are given with precise cubits, 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, and 30 in height, Genesis 6:15. The ark will have compartments, a roof, and a covering of pitch inside and out. It is not a sublime structure of marble and jasper. It is a vessel built according to specifications, designed for preservation, not prestige. The command to build an ark is a call back to stewardship. Use wisdom and labor to preserve life in obedience to the Creator's word. Noah's task is technical and humble. Lumber, pitch, planks, carpentry. There is holiness in such ordinary faithfulness. All the while, the world watches. In many reconstructions of the scene, one can imagine neighbors gathered by the roadside, mouths forming scoffs, pointing at the silhouette of a strange hull against the flat horizon. Ridicule is the natural response of those who have invested their identity in visible success. The idea of flood and judgment is mocked when monuments and altars already assert security. But Noah keeps working. The tirades of the powerful do not change the simple geometry of obedience. Then comes the act of divine sealing. When the ark is finished, when pairs of beasts and the family of the righteous are within, Genesis describes a final, decisive movement. The Lord closes the door, Genesis 7. The image is solemn and deeply theological. The door's closing is not an act of exclusion born of caprice. It is the culmination of covenantal justice. A remnant is preserved so that life may continue. Mercy and judgment meet in that doorway. God provides a refuge while executing the righteous decree born of grief over pervasive corruption. What of the Nephilim in the rising waters? The text does not luxuriate in scenes of their end. It gives us a theological arc rather than a blow-by-blow chronicle. Still, the implications are clear. Boundaries can be enforced by the Creator when broken so radically that restoration requires a reset. The waters cover the earth. The fountains of the great deep burst forth. Rain falls for 40 days and nights, Genesis 7. In those waters, the age of the Nephilim, the era of distorted gifts and idolized power, comes to an end. This end is not described with delight, but with sober necessity. The flood demonstrates that when the created order has been so thoroughly twisted, judgment, painful and terrible, can become the means by which God preserves the possibility of a world that can yet bear faithful life. There is a theological balance here that must not be lost. The flood is both judgment and mercy. Judgment, because sin's consequences are real and devastating. Mercy, because a righteous remnant is spared to continue God's purposes. That paradox is part of the story's sting. God will not abandon the plan of life, even as he acts decisively against corruption. After the waters recede, a new beginning is signaled by covenant, not with an ark, but with a sign in the sky, the rainbow, an emblem of promise, Genesis 9. The earth is repopulated. The terrible age of hybrid giants and their tyrannical culture fades into history. But traces remain. Memory contorts into myth. Stories of towering figures persist. In the poetic imaginations of later peoples, they become titans and colossi, names whispered where the historical specifics have been lost. Archaeological finds sometimes stir the imagination and invite speculation. Large bones misidentified, stone monuments worn by time, oral traditions that recall the people of a different order. Some researchers probe these things. Legends recall them. Art and epic keep some image alive. But caution must be kept. Fascination with ruins and relics cannot replace the clarity of revelation. Speculation is an unanchored thing unless it remains tethered to scripture and careful reasoning. The real shock behind the Nephilim and the flood is not simply that giants once walked the earth. The shock is moral and spiritual. The way gifts can be perverted when creatures refuse their place before God. The same hands that shape metal can shape instruments of war. The same lips that sing can call for self-exaltation. When giftedness is uncoupled from gratitude and responsibility, society warps. The Nephilim symbolize the apex of that warp, greatness taken as end rather than as a means to worship and stewardship. This narrative holds lessons demanded of a listener's conscience. First, gifts and creativity are not morally neutral. They point somewhere. The arts of Cain's line, music, pastoral skills, metallurgy, are good in themselves, but they are dangerous when they foster self-idolatry. Second, social power that is built without accountability becomes a cult. Monuments and lordly altars, when erected in the place of God, will demand tribute and silence dissent. Third, judgment and mercy are not mutually exclusive in God's economy. He both corrects and conserves. Noah's preservation illustrates that even amid righteous wrath, divine purpose continues toward restoration. There is also a pastoral ministering to be heard. The story invites us to examine our own allegiances. Which altars do we set? What do we bow before when the music plays and the metal shines? The call of Noah is simply this: walk with God. Faithfulness is not always glamorous. It is detailed work performed in a world opposed to it. Obedience looks like carpentry and careful gathering of creatures. It looks like choosing the small fidelity over the grand spectacle. That kind of life becomes the seed of continuity when the floodwaters of history come. We must also resist the lure of converting the text into modern conspiracy. The ancient narrative addresses realities of the human heart and cosmic order, not the latest sensational theory. It speaks to the root problems: pride, boundary crossing, the corruption of giftedness. Modern fascination with giants and lost civilizations often forgets the theological center of the story. Some propose archaeological connections, others point to folklore links among disparate cultures. All of those conversations have a place, but none of them can replace what the scripture plainly declares. Human hearts can grow desperately wicked, and God, in his justice and mercy, acts to preserve the possibility of a people who will honor him. The memory of the Nephilim did not disappear without trace. The world kept fragments, myths that remember towering figures, genealogies that mention men of renown. These echoes became raw material for art and for moral teaching in many later communities. They warn us that greatness untethered from humility becomes the scaffolding for tyranny. This is the theological point that the biblical narrator presses. The external horror of size is less important than the internal horror of corrupted orientation. So what then is the shocking truth at the center of this ancient account? It is not a secret catalog of bones or a map to hidden graves. The shock is that the separation between heaven and earth can be breached in the imagination and in the heart. And when that boundary is transgressed, the consequences are catastrophic. The Nephilim story exposes how easily power seduces, how quickly craft can become weapon, and how fragile the moral order is when people begin to take God's authority into their own hands. Noah's calling reveals the remedy, a return to the simple, obedient life that acknowledges a higher allegiance. Faithfulness is the true resistance to idolized greatness. For the Christian listener, this story urges an inward examination. Pride still reshapes gifts and institutions. The modern equivalence of altars, fame, ideology, wealth daily tempts people to worship what should be a means rather than an end. The flood narrative is an exaggerated mirror that shows what can happen when communities allow lordship to slide from creator to creature. It also offers hope. Even when corruption seems near total, God has not abandoned the possibility of a faithful remnant and of renewal. It is important to reiterate the interpretive stance taken here. The reading that identifies the sons of God as angels who fell from their proper domain is a traditional one and is supported by later New Testament references, Jude 6, 2 Peter 2:4. But alternatives exist and deserve respect in scholarly conversation. Whether one reads the passage as angelic transgression or as human pretension to divinity, the ethical core remains striking. Boundaries were broken, gifts were twisted, and judgment followed as a means of preserving a world that could yet worship rightly. If this subject stirs your curiosity and you would like to explore more biblical mysteries handled with care, brief scholarship, and sober imagination, subscribe and follow along. There are other corridors of Scripture where similar themes, boundary, corruption, and remnant, echo and demand attention. When the floodwaters finally withdrew and the ark settled on the mountains of Ararat, life began again with small, ordinary people. Noah's family stepped out into a cleansed world and began the slow labor of reordering life under God's covenant, Genesis 9. The promise of the rainbow testified that God would not again obliterate the earth by flood. It was a pledge that grace would temper judgment. From that new beginning, humanity would rebuild cities and reforge instruments, composing new songs and raising new tents. Yet the memory of what had been, both the gifts and the abuse of those gifts, would not vanish. Myths would grow around it. Giants would stalk the imaginations of poets and peoples. That memory became a moral scar on culture, a reminder that even great things can be instruments of destruction if they sever the human creature from the Creator. For reflection, consider the practical edges of the story. What in our lives functions like a monument calling for tribute? Where do our talents slip from humility into entitlement? How do systems and institutions tempt us to exchange worship of God for worship of power? These are not merely abstract queries. They are the questions the text presses into the bones of anyone who listens. And yet, the story offers a quiet consolation, the preservation of Noah. There is a saving stubbornness to simple faithfulness, a carpentry-level obedience that looks tiny in a world of giants, but that proves durable when the waters rise. Noah's example is not a call to isolation, but to fidelity, to steward what we have been given and to keep our hearts aligned with the Creator. In a culture enchanted by scale, his life stands as a counter-witness. Obedience is often the long, patient shaping of planks, the daily choice to honor God with what one has, rather than to bend one's gifts towards self-exaltation. The ancient episode of the Nephilim and the flood continues to speak then, not as a sensational tale of colossal bodies, but as a pastoral word about the soul. The true astonishment is moral. How breathtakingly fast a society can careen from worship to idolatry when power is allowed to elevate itself above gratitude. The flood becomes the stern parent who intervenes, not in joy, but in sorrow and necessity, to stop a harm that would otherwise be endless. In closing, return to Genesis and read the passages for yourself. Genesis 4 gives the genealogy of Cain and the cultural context. Genesis 6, 1-4 frames the mysterious breach. Genesis 6, 5-13 explains the depth of humanity's corruption. Genesis 7-9 recounts the flood and the covenant that followed. Read Jude 6 and 2 Peter 2:4 to see how later writers interpret the notion of angels who did not keep their proper domain. Let the text speak plainly, and let it press its questions into your life. The shocking truth, when fully faced, humbles and warns. It shows how greatness can be idolized, how skill can be corrupted, and how God's justice and mercy operate together. It also points to a hope that is practical and ordinary, a life walked in obedience to the Creator, a life that honors gifts by returning them to their rightful end. Will you join the remnant of those who choose integrity over the spectacle of false power? Will you, like Noah, build what must be built, even when the world laughs? If this message moved you, read Genesis 6-9 slowly this week. Reflect on where your heart aligns, and consider subscribing for more careful explorations of Scripture's hardest passages. The past holds warnings, and the future holds mercy, and in both, the call remains the same: walk with God.